The snow had been falling for 3 days straight when Clara Whitmore realized the world above her had gone completely silent. And it was that silence, not the cold, not the dark, not the dwindling flame of her oil lamp, that told her she was buried alive. The year was 1879, and the Nebraska sandhills had seen hard winters before. Old Jacob Prentice down at the trading post had warned anyone who would listen that the sky had a particular yellow-gray look to it come late October, the kind of color that meant the plains were about to remind settlers exactly how small and fragile they truly were. Clara had nodded at his warning, the way she always nodded when the old men of Harlan County spoke about the land as though it were a living, breathing adversary with a personal grudge. She had stocked her root cellar, filled her water barrel, brought in an extra quart of firewood, and told herself she was ready. She had not been ready. The blizzard came down from the Dakotas like something biblical. It came without ceremony, without the courtesy of a slow build, sweeping across the open grassland with a fury that seemed to carry genuine malice in every howling gust. Clara had been born in Ohio and had come west 3 years prior with her husband Thomas, who had broken a quarter section of this hard, unyielding Nebraska earth with his own 2 hands and built her this sod house from the prairie itself. They had carved bricks from the ground, stacking them into thick walls that held the heat in winter and the cool in summer, and Thomas had been proud of it. He had stood in the doorway of that small, dark, earthen home with his chest puffed out like a man who had just built a cathedral. Thomas had died 14 months ago, a fever that took him in a week, leaving Clara alone on 160 acres of Nebraska grassland with 2 milk cows, a mule named Henderson, a quarter section claim she intended to keep, and a grief so deep and so quiet it had settled into her bones like frost settles into the ground, invisible from the outside but present in everything. She was 24 years old, and she had no intention of leaving. The sod house sat in a shallow depression between 2 low hills, which Thomas had chosen deliberately because it provided shelter from the wind. In a normal winter, those hills were a blessing. In the blizzard of 1879, they became a trap. The wind drove the snow down off the hills in sheets and curtains, piling it against the earthen walls in great drifts that grew higher with each passing hour. Clara had stood at her single small window on the first afternoon and watched the snow accumulate against the glass, rising slowly, and she had thought it would stop. It always stopped. By the second morning, the window was completely white. By the second night, she could no longer push her door open. She had pressed her shoulder against the wood and shoved with everything she had, and the door had not moved a single inch. The snow packed against it was not light and powdery, but dense and compacted, squeezed tight by the pressure of more snow falling on top of it, and Clara had stood in her dark little house and felt, for the first time in 3 days, truly frightened. She had lit her oil lamp and taken inventory of her situation with the calm, methodical approach that her mother had always called Clara's great strength and her father had always called Clara's great stubbornness. She had food enough for 2 weeks. She had firewood stacked along the interior wall, enough for perhaps 5 days of steady burning. She had water in the barrel, already going slushy at the edges. She had her 2 cows, which were in the small attached lean-to on the south side of the house, and their warmth seeped through the thin partition wall and added a degree or 2 of precious heat to the room. She had Henderson in the lean-to as well, and the mule was unhappy about the situation, but alive. What she did not have was a way out, and with each passing hour, the snow above her grew heavier, pressing down on the roof of her house, which was sod laid over rough-cut timber joists that Thomas had hauled from 60 miles away. The timbers creaked. They had been creaking since the second day, a low, intermittent groaning that she felt in her back teeth more than she heard with her ears. On the morning of the 3rd day, she had heard the roof settle with a sound like a gunshot, and one of the joists had bowed visibly downward. She had looked up at it in the lamplight and understood with perfect clarity that the weight of the snow above her was going to crush this house into the earth and that she was going to be inside it when it happened. She had done the only thing she could think to do. She had taken her largest cast-iron pot and climbed up onto her table and begun to pound on the ceiling above her, driving the pot upward into the sod with steady, rhythmic strokes, not frantically but with purpose. She did not expect anyone to hear her. She was 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, old widow Halverson, who was herself likely buried. She was 8 miles from the town of Millbrook, which might as well have been 800 miles in conditions like these. She pounded the ceiling because it was the only action available to her, and Clara Whitmore, in her 24 years of life, had never been good at doing nothing. She pounded until her arms gave out, and then she sat on her table in the lamplight, wrapped in every blanket she owned, listening to the timbers groan. And she waited. Eli Cade had been coming down out of the mountains for 6 days. He had spent the summer and early autumn deep in the high country west of the Black Hills, trapping and hunting and existing in the particular solitude that he had, over the course of 31 years, come to understand was not loneliness, but something more like necessity. He was a man built for open spaces, for the clean, cold air above the tree line, for weeks at a time without another human voice. He was 6 feet and 3 inches of muscle and bone, forged by a decade of mountain living, with shoulders wide enough to fill most doorframes and hands that had the particular roughness of a man who used them constantly and hard. His dark hair fell past his collar, and his beard was full and dark, streaked at the chin with a thread of premature silver that he had never paid much attention to. He moved through rough country with a sureness that looked almost lazy until you tried to keep pace with him and found that you could not. He had a horse named Brutus, a big Roman-nosed roan that was ugly in the way that very capable things sometimes are, and 2 pack mules loaded with the season's take in furs. He had been planning to ride south and east to trade at Millbrook, then winter somewhere in the lower country before heading back up in the spring. It was not a complicated plan, and Eli Cade preferred uncomplicated plans. What he had not planned for was the storm. He had seen it coming 2 days before it arrived, reading the sky the way his old trapping partner, a Lakota man named Red Knife, who had taught Eli most of what he knew about surviving in wild country, had taught him to read it. That yellow-gray color on the northern horizon, the particular stillness of the air before the wind reversed, the way the birds moved south 3 days ahead of any visible storm front. He had pushed Brutus hard and made good time, dropping out of the hill country and onto the open grassland of the Nebraska sandhills, where he had intended to find shelter at one of the homestead claims he knew were scattered across this stretch of country. The storm had caught him anyway. It came down faster and harder than even his experienced eye had predicted, and he had spent 2 days sheltering in a shallow ravine with Brutus and the mules, burning what scrub wood he could find, and wrapping himself and the animals in every hide he was carrying. He had not been warm exactly, but he had been alive, which was the only standard that mattered on the open plains in a blizzard. When the worst of the wind broke on the morning of the 3rd day, he had saddled Brutus in a world gone entirely white and silent, and ridden east toward what he remembered of the homestead claims in this area. The snow was deep and drifted wildly, 6 inches in one place and 6 feet in another, and Brutus navigated it with the stolid competence that had always made Eli grateful for the ugly horse. He had been riding for perhaps 2 hours when Brutus stopped. The horse did this sometimes in the mountains when something was wrong, some animal smell or unstable ground, and Eli had learned to pay attention to it. He sat in the saddle and looked around at the white landscape, and at first he saw nothing but snow and the low humps of the hills and the pale winter sky. Then he looked down at the ground directly ahead of Brutus, at a wide, shallow depression between 2 hills that was filled with snow so deep and so perfectly smooth that it looked like a bowl of cream, and something caught his eye. There was a faint smudge of gray rising from the center of the depression, barely visible, barely there, so thin that a man not looking for it would not have seen it at all. Smoke, coming up through 8 feet of snow from somewhere below. Eli was off Brutus in one motion, his boots crunching down into snow up to his thighs. He slogged forward through the depression, plowing with his body because there was no other way through, and as he got closer, he could see the faint outline of what he recognized as a sod roof, the regular rectangular edges of it visible under the snow only because he was close enough now to look straight down. The smoke was coming from a stovepipe that jutted up maybe 3 inches above the snowpack, just barely clear, and it was the thinnest trail of smoke he had ever seen, which told him the fire inside was nearly out. He dropped to his knees and pressed his ear against the snow. He heard it after a moment, rhythmic, muffled, the unmistakable sound of something striking the underside of the roof. Someone was in there, and they were alive. Eli Cade was back on his feet before the thought finished forming. He plunged back through the snow to Brutus, yanked his axe from the pack, and returned to the spot above the roof at a dead run. He drove the head of the axe into the snow and began to dig, not with the axe handle, but with his hands and arms, scooping and throwing and compacting, creating a shaft downward toward the roof. He worked with the focused economy of a man who knew exactly what was at stake and had no energy to waste on panic or hesitation. The snow was dense and heavy, compacted by its own weight, and each armful he lifted and threw behind him felt like it weighed 30 pounds. His shoulders burned within the first 5 minutes. He ignored them. His gloves filled with snow and went from cold to soaking wet, and then to something past cold, and he ignored that too. He dug because there was a person below him, and that was the only fact that mattered. He broke through the snow layer and hit the sod roof after perhaps 20 minutes of digging. The shaft he had created was maybe 3 feet in diameter, narrower at the bottom where the last layers of snow had been the most compact, and he was in it up to his chest when his hands hit something solid and dark. He swept the last of the snow away and looked down at rough-cut sod bricks covered in frost, and he picked up his axe. "Stand back!" he shouted, his voice dropping down through the snow shaft. "I'm coming through the roof! Stand back from beneath me!" Below, in the lamplight and cold and fear of the buried house, Clara Whitmore heard a man's voice come down from directly above her like a voice from heaven, and she nearly fell off the table in shock. She had heard the digging. She had heard the muffled, rhythmic sound of it for the past 20 minutes and had told herself it was the sound of the snow settling, because she was not going to let herself hope for something that could not possibly be real. There was no one coming. There was no one within miles. She was alone, and the roof was going to come down, and she had made her peace with that, or she had tried to. But that was unmistakably a human voice. She scrambled off the table, throwing her blankets aside, and pressed herself against the far wall as the axe came through the sod above her in a shower of frozen earth and snow and cold air that hit her like a fist. She gasped at the cold, pulling her coat tighter, and looked up through the hole that was opening in her ceiling as the axe rose and fell with mechanical efficiency, widening the breach with each stroke. More frozen earth fell. More cold air poured in, and she saw a blue winter sky above the hole, so white and pale it looked like porcelain. And then a man's face appeared in the opening, framed by the walls of the snow shaft he had dug, looking down at her. He was not what she had expected. She had expected some neighbor she barely knew, some bundled farmer with a worried face. What she saw instead was a man who looked like the mountain itself had sent down a representative. Dark hair plastered with snow, a beard full and dark against a face that was windburned and strongly made, with a jaw like a shelf of rock and eyes that were a particular shade of gray-green she had never seen before. Those eyes found her immediately, scanning the room, taking stock with the swift efficiency of someone who had been in emergencies before and knew how to read them. "Are you hurt?" His voice was deep and unhurried despite everything. He was breathing hard from the digging, but his voice was steady. "No," Clara said, and was surprised by how steady her own voice was. "No, I'm not hurt. The roof is going to come down. One of the joists has cracked." He looked up at the bowed joist without expression, assessed it for about 2 seconds, and then looked back down at her. "Can you climb?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and she meant it. He reached his arm down through the hole, and his arm was long and heavily muscled, and she could see the strain of his grip even through the heavy canvas of his coat sleeve. "There is a rope on my saddle. I'm going to get it. Do not let that fire go out. Keep the smoke coming through the pipe, or I may lose the location." He disappeared. She heard him moving above her, heard him talking to a horse, heard the crunch and pull of his boots in snow. She turned and threw the last of her firewood onto the stove, the damp pieces she had been saving, hoping they would catch on what remained of the coals. They smoked extravagantly, and then, finally, they caught, and she felt the small gratitude of a flame held. He was back within 3 minutes, his face reappearing in the opening above her. He lowered a rope, and it swung in the pale light of her lamp, and she grabbed it. "I am going to brace against the edge of the shaft," he said. "You tie that under your arms and I will pull. Or if you can climb, climb, and I will guide you." "I can climb," Clara said, because she was not going to be hauled up through her own roof like a sack of grain if she could help it. She knotted the rope under her arms anyway, because she was sensible about it, and she began to climb. The shaft was narrow, and the sod walls crumbled at the edges as she pushed against them, but she pushed her boots into the snow and the dirt and worked her way upward, and he reached down, and when his hands closed around her wrists, she felt the strength in them like a physical fact, something absolute. And in one smooth pull, she was through the hole and into the blinding white world above. She came up gasping into air so cold it felt solid, and the light after 3 days of lamplight hit her like a wave, and she squeezed her eyes shut against it. She was kneeling in the snow at the top of the shaft he had dug, and he was kneeling beside her with one hand still on her arm, steady as a post. "Easy," he said. "Take a breath. You have been in the dark for a while." She opened her eyes slowly, letting them adjust, and looked at him. Up close, he was larger than he had seemed through the hole. He was the kind of large that was not fat or soft, but purely structural, the size of a man whose body had been built by years of hard physical work in hard physical conditions. His coat was soaked from the digging, and she could see the muscle of his forearms where his gloves had ridden up. His gray-green eyes were watching her with a directness that was not unkind, but was absolutely unnerving. "You dug through the snow," she said, which was obvious, and she knew it, but she could not think of what else to say. "Your stovepipe was still clear," he said, as though this explained everything. "I saw the smoke." "My animals are still inside," she said, and he heard the urgency in it and did not dismiss it. "We will get them," he said. "But first I need to get you to somewhere warm. There's a ravine about a quarter-mile west where I sheltered last night. It is not much, but it is out of the wind." Clara looked around at the landscape. It was an alien world. The hills she knew, the low swells of ground that were her landmarks, were transformed into smooth white shapes that barely resembled the country she had walked for 3 years. The sky was clear now, that crystalline pale blue that follows a major storm, and the sun on the snow was so bright it was painful. In every direction, as far as she could see, there was nothing but white. "My cows," she said again. He looked at her for a moment with those gray-green eyes, and she could see him weighing options with the same methodical calm she recognized in herself. "Show me," he said. She led him around the side of the buried house to where the lean-to was, and together they worked to dig out its low door. He did most of the digging, his arms working in long, powerful strokes that moved more snow in a minute than she could have moved in 10. And when the door was clear, he pulled it open, and the smell of cow and mule and warm animal breath hit them both in a wave that felt almost luxurious after the cold. Henderson looked out at the snow and at the large stranger and laid his ears back in displeasure. "That is a good mule," the man said, with what Clara suspected was irony. "His name is Henderson," she said. "He is not good. He is reliable, which is different." The man laughed, a short, genuine sound, and she noticed the way it changed his face. The seriousness lifted for a moment, and he looked younger, and something in the quality of his attention shifted from assessment to something warmer. They led the cows out first, the animals stumbling into the snow and shaking their heads at the world they found. Henderson came last, stepping high and indignant, and the man tied them all together on a line with a practiced ease that spoke of long experience with animals in difficult conditions. "I am Eli Cade," he said, holding out his hand. She shook it, and his hand was enormous around hers, warm despite the cold and the wet gloves. "Clara Whitmore," she said. He looked at her with an expression she had seen before on men who noticed the absence of a husband and were computing what it meant. She waited for him to say something about it. He did not. Instead, he said, "I have a camp west of here, and 2 pack mules. We will consolidate and get moving before it starts again." He looked at the sky. "This break will not hold. There is more coming tonight." "How do you know?" she asked. "The sky tells you, if you know how to read it." She looked up at the pale blue expanse above them and tried to see what he saw in it. She saw blue sky and winter sun and nothing else. "I will take your word for it," she said. They walked west through the snow, Eli breaking trail with the tireless, steady power of a man who had been doing this sort of thing his whole life, Clara following in the channel, his big body cut through the drifts, leading Henderson, who led the 2 cows behind him. The walking was still brutal. The snow in the open stretches was knee-deep on him and waist-deep on her, and in places where it had drifted against the natural windbreaks of the landscape, it was over her head. He would reach back and take her hand in those places, not making a production of it, just extending his arm backward, and she would take it, and he would pull her through. She was not a woman who needed pulling through things as a general principle. She had managed 14 months alone on a claim in hard country without anyone's help, but she was practical enough to know the difference between pride and survival, and she took his hand when he offered it. The ravine was where he said it was, a shallow cut in the hillside where a long dry creek had once run, lined with scrub cedar and buffered from the north wind. His roan horse was tied there, along with 2 heavily loaded pack mules, and a small fire had been banked in a ring of stones that still held coals. He had a proper camp, she noted, laid out with a competence that spoke of long practice. His bedroll was on a folded deer hide, his gear was organized and covered with oilskin, and there was a cast-iron pot hanging on a rod over the fire pit. He rebuilt the fire quickly, feeding it dry wood he had stored under the oilskin cover, and within 10 minutes there was a proper flame going. He hung the pot and began to work on something that turned out to be a broth of dried meat and some kind of root she did not recognize, working with the matter-of-fact competence of a man who cooked not for pleasure, but because eating kept you alive, and he was good at the things that kept him alive. Clara sat on the deer hide he directed her to and held her hands toward the fire and felt the cold begin to release its grip on her fingers and toes, in a wave of painful tingling that she welcomed because pain meant sensation, and sensation meant alive. She looked at Eli Cade across the fire, at the broad set of his shoulders and the way the firelight moved across the planes of his face, and she thought about how close she had been to never sitting by a fire again. "How did you come to be out here?" she asked, "in the middle of a storm like this?" He told her about the mountains and the trapping and the season's work, about Red Knife and the high country, about reading the sky and not reading it quite well enough this time. He talked the way some men talk, economically, in complete sentences, without decoration, as though he was reporting facts rather than telling a story. "You came down to trade at Millbrook," she said. "Eventually." He stirred the broth. "I have been coming through this country for 6 years. I generally winter south of here, near the Republican River." "You know this land, then?" "Better than most." She was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled and the horses shifted on their lines, and from somewhere in the cedars, a gray jay called once and was silent. "My husband built that house," she said. It came out before she intended it to, and she was not sure why she said it, except that the house was still there under the snow, probably still intact, and the thought of Thomas building it with his careful hands was suddenly and vividly present in her mind. Eli looked up from the pot. His gray-green eyes were quiet and attentive, not pushing, not filling the silence with condolence. "He died 14 months ago," she said. "A fever." "I'm sorry," Eli said. The words were simple and direct, and she believed them, which she did not always believe when people said them. "I am not leaving the claim," she said, and there was a firmness in it she heard herself. "Everyone has an opinion about that. Widow Halverson thinks I should go east. The men at the land office in Millbrook think I should go east. They are all wrong." "I expect they are," Eli said with no particular emphasis, and she blinked at him, because that was not the response she had expected. She had been braced for the version of this conversation she had been having for 14 months, where she stated her intention to stay, and someone explained to her why a woman alone could not manage a claim. "You agree," she said. "You lasted 14 months alone on a Sandhills claim," he said. "You laid in your winter stores, and then you survived 3 days buried under 8 feet of snow without losing your livestock or your mind. That is not a woman who needs to go east." He glanced up at her. "That is a woman who needs a better roof." She stared at him for a moment, and then she laughed, and it felt strange in her mouth, because she had not laughed in a long time. Not since Thomas, not really. She had smiled in the functional way that social interaction required, but she had not laughed, and this laugh came up out of her with a startled quality that surprised her. He was watching her with a careful, wondering expression, as though he was seeing something he had not expected. Then, the corner of his mouth turned up and he looked back down at the broth, and she had the sense that he was very deliberately not making anything of the moment, giving her room, and she was grateful for that. "Eat this," he said, passing her a tin cup of broth, and she wrapped her cold hands around it and drank, and it was the best thing she had ever tasted. The second storm came that evening, as he had predicted. They heard it build from the north, the wind rising through the cedars with a sound like something being torn, and he had spent the intervening hours preparing for it with grim efficiency. He had extended the cedar windbreak with cut branches, creating a rough lean-to structure against the hillside that would not win any architectural prizes but would block the worst of the wind. He had tied the animals in close, with doubled blankets on the horses, and he had stacked firewood under the oilskin until it was a pile as high as Clara's shoulder. Clara had not stood by watching any of this. She had cut cedar branches with the small hatchet from his pack until her arms ached, had cooked a second meal over the fire, had checked on the animals, and milked the cows with hands that had finally recovered feeling. She worked alongside him without being asked and without speaking much, and she could feel him noticing this, the way a person notices when something meets an expectation they had not quite articulated. When the storm hit and they were huddled under the lean-to, wrapped in every blanket and hide that could be shared between them, without impropriety, and with one blanket that could not but which was better than freezing, she could feel the solid warmth of him against her side, and thought that proximity to another person was something she had been managing without for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. "Tell me about the mountains," she said, because the wind was too loud to sleep through and they needed something to do with the hours. He was quiet for a moment, and then he began to talk. He talked about the black hills and the high meadows above the tree line, about the way elk moved through the early morning mist, and the way a clear mountain stream looked in summer, running over white granite stones in water so cold it made your teeth ache to drink it. He talked about the Lakota and the Cheyenne with a respect and directness that surprised her, talking about Red Knife as though the man were a person of significance and wisdom rather than merely someone he had been acquainted with. And she thought about how many men of her experience spoke about the native peoples of this land with fear or contempt or the casual dismissal of the powerful for the dispossessed. Eli Cade did neither. "You lived among them," she said. "For a winter," he said. "Red Knife's family took me in when I was 22 and broke and lost in the first real blizzard I had ever been caught in. His mother fed me and his father taught me how to read sign, and I stayed through the winter. It was the most important winter of my life." "What became of them?" she asked, though she had a sense she knew. His jaw tightened slightly. "They were moved to the reservation in '76, he said. "After the Custer business, Red Knife wrote to me. He did not complain. That was Red Knife. But I know what the reservation means." There was something in his voice that was not quite anger, but was adjacent to it, a controlled, abiding sorrow. "It is not right," he said. "What was done to those people is not right, and the men in Washington who did it will answer for it in whatever manner men answer for their crimes, in this world or the next." Clara looked at him in the firelight that flickered at the edges of the lean-to, at the hard set of his jaw and the honesty in his face, and she thought that this was a man who said what he believed and believed what he said, and that this was rarer than it should have been. "My Thomas thought the same," she said quietly. "He would have liked you." The wind screamed through the cedars above them, and the fire guttered and steadied, and Eli Cade looked at her with those gray-green eyes and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "He sounds like a good man." "He was," she said simply. They sat in the roar of the storm, shoulder to shoulder, and Clara thought about grief and time and the strange mercy of emergencies, which stripped everything down to the essential and showed you what was real. The second storm lasted through the night and into the next morning, and when it broke, the world was even more thoroughly buried than before. Eli climbed out of the lean-to in the gray dawn and looked around at a landscape of white humps and drifts that had rearranged everything the first storm had shaped, and he made the calculation quickly. "We cannot stay here indefinitely," he said when he came back under the lean-to where Clara was rebuilding the fire with practiced hands. "The animals need better shelter and more feed than I have, and your cows especially. If we stay too long, we lose them." Clara looked up from the fire. She had been thinking the same thing. Millbrook is 8 miles, she said. In this snow, with these animals, that is a day and a half of hard travel, he said, but it is doable. My house, she said, and he understood what she meant. The roof will need reinforcing before it is safe to use, he said, but the walls are sound. Sod walls that thick do not come down. He paused. Give me 2 days to work on it, once we have a root cleared, and I can make it solid again. She looked at him. Why, she asked, and the question was direct and genuine. She wanted to understand the calculation he was making. He met her eyes and was quiet for a moment, in the way she had already come to recognize meant he was choosing his words honestly rather than reflexively. Because you built a life here, he said, and that house is part of it. And because I am a man who knows how to build things and you need it done. It was not a romantic answer. It was a practical answer delivered without theater, and she respected it more for that. All right, she said, Millbrook first, then back. He nodded, and they began to pack. The journey to Millbrook was exactly as brutal as he had predicted, and in some ways worse. The trail was non-existent, buried under drifts that had smoothed the landscape into perfect deception, where what looked like solid ground was often a drift covering a depression, and what looked like a dangerous slope was actually firm. Eli went first on Brutus, breaking trail, reading the ground with an attentiveness that Clara watched with genuine admiration. He stopped frequently, sometimes dismounting to probe the snow with a long stick before committing the horse to forward movement. He never rushed it, never seemed frustrated by the slowness, just worked through it systematically. Henderson followed Brutus with resigned competence, and the cows came behind Henderson, and Clara rode one of Eli's pack mules because he insisted, and she accepted, after calculating that she was slowing the whole procession down when she walked. They stopped midday in a place where a stand of cottonwoods along a frozen creek provided enough shelter to build a small fire and eat and rest the animals. Clara's cows were doing better than expected, the big, hardy Nebraska range stock that Thomas had selected specifically for their hardiness, and she told Eli this. He chose well, Eli said, feeding the fire. He chose everything well, Clara said, and then caught herself, because there was something in the repetition of it that felt like she was making a point. She looked at the fire. I'm sorry. I do not mean to constantly speak of him. Do not apologize for that, Eli said, and his voice was firm in a way that was not unkind, but would not accommodate her self-consciousness. He was your husband. He built your house and stocked your claim and chose your cattle, and then he left you to face it all alone, which I expect he hated even as he did it, because he was a man who chose well. Speak of him. Clara felt something give way in her chest, some tight-held thing she had been managing without naming. Her eyes stung, and she blinked it away, because the cold gave her a reasonable excuse for it. Thank you, she said, and meant it in a way that had nothing to do with politeness. They reached Millbrook on the afternoon of the second day, coming into the small cluster of buildings along the main street in a way that drew stares from the few citizens who were out digging out their own establishments after the storm. Millbrook was not much of a town. It had a general store, a livery, a saloon that doubled as a boarding house, a small land office, and a church that also served as a schoolhouse 3 days a week. The population was perhaps 60 people in winter, swelling to 120 in summer when the surrounding homesteads were more actively occupied. The man who ran the livery was named Gus Peterson, a broad Norwegian with a blond beard going gray and the arms of a man who had worked with horses his whole life. He came out into the snow when he heard Brutus's big hooves on the packed street and looked at the procession with the assessing eye of a man who knew animals. Bad way out there, he asked. Passable now, Eli said. Gus looked at Clara. Mrs. Whitmore, he said with the combination of surprise and relief that told her he had been worried. We thought you might have been lost in it. Nearly, she said. Mr. Cade dug through her roof, Henderson the mule said. Or rather, that was how it registered in Clara's exhausted mind. Because what Henderson actually did was try to bite Gus Peterson's hat, and in the ensuing distraction, the question of who had saved whom and under what circumstances got deferred until they were all inside the warm, dim, hay-smelling comfort of the livery, with the animals in stalls and blankets over them and water heating on the livery's small stove. Eli stripped off his coat and hung it to dry, and Clara watched the way his broad shoulders moved as he worked with the horses, the easy competence of someone completely at home with the physical demands of his life. She had been seeing him for 2 days now in the focused context of survival, and it was only now, in the relative safety of the town, that she began to see him differently, to see him as he was rather than as the mechanism of her rescue. He was a remarkable-looking man. She acknowledged this to herself the way she acknowledged practical facts, without drama. Tall and broadly built, with hands that were scarred and capable, with a face that was not pretty in the way of a parlor illustration, but was interesting, the kind of face made by weather and character rather than by beauty. Those gray-green eyes were extraordinary. She had not stopped noticing them. He caught her looking, and she did not look away, because she was not a woman who made a habit of pretending. He held her gaze for a moment and then looked back down at his work, but there was something different in the set of his jaw after that, some internal adjustment she did not entirely understand. Martha Connolly, who ran the boarding house side of the saloon with iron efficiency and a warm heart, gave Clara a room and a hot bath and a meal that made her want to weep from pure gratitude. She soaked in the hot water until it went cold, and then soaked a little longer, because she had been cold for 4 days, and she was not done with being warm yet. When she came down to supper, Eli was at the table already, clean-shaven below the beard and in a fresh shirt that told her he had his own room and had made good use of the time. He stood when she came in, which she had not expected from a mountain man, and pulled out the chair beside him, which she also had not expected. Martha watched this from the kitchen doorway with barely concealed interest. "You look better," Eli said. Not a compliment exactly, more an observation, though the way he said it made it feel like one. "I feel human," Clara said, "which is an improvement on how I felt this morning." "The cold does that," he said, "takes the person out of you." They ate together, and the conversation was easier now, in the warm and the light, without the constant background roar of survival. She told him about Ohio, about coming west with Thomas in the first years of homesteading, about the particular kind of hope that settlers brought with them and the particular way the land tested it. He told her about growing up in Tennessee, about a father who drank and a mother who endured, and a younger brother he still sent money to when he had it. He told her how he had come west at 19 with nothing but a horse and a knife and a stubbornness that he credited his mother with. "She sounds formidable," Clara said. "She was," he said. "She would have approved of you." It landed softly, not pushing, and she let it sit. The next 3 days in Millbrook settled into a rhythm that surprised Clara with its comfort. The town was digging out, and there was a communal energy to it, neighbors helping neighbors, someone's wagon stuck in the packed snow of the main street being freed by 6 men working together, someone else's chicken house collapsed under the weight, and the chickens being rehomed temporarily in Gus Pedersen's livery, to the outrage of Brutus and the philosophical acceptance of the mules. Eli spent his days repairing things. She came to understand that this was simply what he did. He saw what was broken, and he fixed it. He spent a day reinforcing the frame of the livery's hay storage where the snow weight had buckled it. He helped 2 families dig out their houses in the western quarter of town. He spent an afternoon cutting firewood for old Jacob Prentice, who had twisted his ankle on ice and could not manage it himself. He did all of this without announcement and without accepting more than a meal in return, and Clara watched people's reactions to him, the way men treated him with respect and women with trust and children with the instinctive magnet pull they have toward people who are safe. She was not immune to any of this. On the second evening, they were sitting in Martha Connolly's common room with 2 or 3 others from the town, and someone brought out a fiddle, and someone else knew the words to a song, and without any planning or ceremony, there was music. The kind of music that happens in small places in cold weather when the danger has passed and the relief needs somewhere to go. Clara found herself singing, to her own surprise, because she had not sung in a long time, and her voice was rusty, but it was there. Eli watched her sing with an expression she could not fully read. It was attentive and quiet and somehow held, like a man who was being careful with something he was not yet sure about. Later, when the others had gone to bed and the fire was burning low, and Martha had tactfully found reasons to be elsewhere, they were alone in the common room, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that exists between people who have already been through something together and do not need to fill every space with words. "I should ask you something," Clara said. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes, waiting. "When we go back to the claim," she said, "when you fix the roof, what happens after?" The question was practical, and she meant it practically, but she also meant it in the other way, the way underneath the practical way, and she thought he heard both. "I go south for the winter," he said. "That is what I had planned." "And in the spring?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. The fire popped. Outside, the wind had stilled, and the night was very quiet in the particular way of post-storm nights when the world holds its breath. "I had not planned the spring," he said honestly. "I never planned that far." "I see," she said. "Clara," he said, and the way he said her name was different from the way he had been saying it, more careful, more direct. "I am not a man who says things he does not mean." "I know that," she said. "Then I will not say what I am not ready to say," he said. "But I will say that I have not thought about the spring in a very long time, and I have been thinking about it since yesterday, which is unusual for me." She looked at him steadily. "That is honest," she said. "It is the only thing I know how to be," he said. She nodded, and they sat with the fire for a while longer, and when she went to bed, she lay in the warm room and looked at the ceiling and felt something she had not felt in 14 months. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but the precursor to it, the possibility of it, like the first warmth you feel when you come in from the cold, before you are quite sure whether you are actually warming or only imagining it. They left Millbrook 4 days after arriving, on a morning that was cold but clear, the sky a deep winter blue, and the snow settling and firming into a surface that Brutus could manage without too much difficulty. Eli had acquired lumber from the general store's limited supply, paying for it from his fur trade earnings in coin that he counted out without complaint, and he had loaded it on his pack mules with the furs redistributed in ways that did not look comfortable for the mules, but which they bore without complaint, because Eli had a way with animals that went beyond management into something more like understanding. Clara rode Henderson, who had been in the livery's good pasture for 4 days, and was marginally less disagreeable for it. The ride back to her claim felt different from the ride away from it. She knew the way the snow lay now, knew the drifts and the cleared patches, knew where Eli would go ahead and where he would wait for her. There was a familiarity to moving with him through landscape that had not existed on the first journey, and she found herself aware of it. When they came over the low ridge above the depression where her sod house sat, she stopped Brutus and looked down at the roof. It was still intact, she could see that much, still buried but not collapsed, and the satisfaction of that was a particular kind of relief. Eli stopped beside her on his horse and looked down at it. "The joists need sistering," he said. "New lumber alongside the old ones to take the load, and the sod on top needs to be redistributed when the snow clears, thinned out. Your husband laid it too thick." "He erred on the side of caution," Clara said, and there was a small fond exasperation in it that made Eli look at her sideways. "A good fault," he said. They worked their way down to the house, and Eli dug out the door with the same systematic efficiency he brought to everything, and they went in together for the first time, through the doorway, into the cold earthen room where the lamp had burned out and the stove was dark and cold, and above them the hole in the roof was letting in a column of winter light that made the dust motes and frost crystals in the air sparkle in a way that was, briefly, beautiful. Clara stood in the doorway of her home and looked at the hole in her ceiling and thought about the first morning after Thomas died, when she had stood in the same spot and understood that she was going to have to manage everything alone. She had stood there for a long time, and then she had gone to work, because that was what you did. You went to work. She went to work now, cleaning out the cold ash from the stove and rebuilding the fire, while Eli rigged a rope and pole system that would let him work on the roof from the inside, bracing the bowed joist temporarily while he positioned the new lumber. He moved through the small space with a care that surprised her, his big frame navigating the low-ceilinged room without awkwardness, ducking beams and shifting around furniture with a spatial awareness that spoke of long practice in small spaces in rough country. By midday, the stove was going and the room was warming, and Eli had the first new joist sistered to the old one, and spiked into the end beams with nails from the general store. The transformation in the roof was immediate and audible. The groaning stopped. The sag in the bowed timber was not corrected, because nothing but time and drying would fully do that, but it was supported, and the new lumber took the load with the clean confidence of fresh wood doing what wood was built to do. He came down off the makeshift scaffold he had built from her kitchen chairs and her wood box, and looked up at the repaired ceiling with the particular expression of a craftsman assessing his own work. "That will hold," he said. "I believe you," she said. He looked at her, and there was a warmth in his gray-green eyes that was different from the careful, assessed warmth of the first days, something more direct in it, and she met it without looking away. "I need to patch the hole," he said. "I will need to do it from above. I will need another half day." "Then you will stay for supper," she said. He held her gaze for a moment and then said, "Yes," and it was a simple word, but she heard all of it. He stayed for supper, and then he stayed the night because the temperature dropped sharply after dark, and the prudent thing was to wait for morning, and they both knew this was the prudent thing, and neither of them made anything more of it. He slept on the floor by the stove, wrapped in his bedroll, and Clara slept in her bed in the corner, and the small earthen house held both of them with the uncomplicated generosity of shelter. In the morning, she woke to find the fire already rebuilt, and coffee, genuine coffee from his pack, heating in the pot, and the smell of it was so unexpectedly wonderful that she lay in bed for a moment just breathing it before she got up. He was outside working before the sun was fully up, climbing the snow slope with lumber under his arm to patch the hole in the roof, and she could hear him moving above her, the measured sounds of work being done with care. She dressed and did the morning chores, milking the cows and feeding Henderson and checking that the animals had survived the cold night well, and by the time she came back inside with a bucket of milk, he was climbing back down through the now sealed and reinforced opening in the ceiling, which was not a hole anymore but a patched seam that was visibly not original, but was solid. "It will need a full resodding in the spring," he said, brushing frozen earth from his coat. "But it will not let weather in now." She handed him the coffee. He took it and wrapped his hands around the tin cup and looked at her over the rim of it, and the morning light that came through the small west-facing window caught the silver thread in his beard and the green in his gray eyes. And Clara Whitmore thought, with the directness that was her defining characteristic, that she was in considerable danger of losing her heart to this man. "Your furs," she said. "You need to get to Millbrook to trade them." "I do," he said. "And then south for the winter," she said. He set the coffee cup down on her table and looked at her, and there was something shifting in him that she could see but could not quite name, something that had been moving underneath the surface of the past days and was now very close to the surface. "I have been thinking," he said. "You mentioned that," she said. "I meant what I said. I'm thinking about the spring." He paused. "About this country. About whether a man who has spent 10 years going back to the mountains could find a reason to spend more time in the low country." She watched him. He was not a man who said things lightly, and she was not a woman who heard them that way. "That would depend on the reason," she said. "It would depend," he agreed, "on whether the reason would have him." She was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet she thought about Thomas, about the particular ache of loving someone and losing them, and about whether the ache itself was a reason not to try again or a reason that you already knew how much trying was worth. "I am a woman with a claim, and a mule, and 2 cows and a roof that needs resodding in the spring," she said. "I'm not an easy situation." "I have never been interested in easy," he said. "I'm still grieving in the quiet ways," she said, because she owed him that honesty. "I know that," he said. "I'm not asking you to stop." She looked at him steadily. "I do not know you well enough," she said. "No," he said. "That is what the spring is for." She considered this for a long moment, long enough that he waited without pushing, giving her room the way he always gave her room, and she thought that this was itself a thing worth noting. "Go to Millbrook," she said. "Trade your furs, winter south, and when the spring comes and you come north, I will be here." Something happened in his face, a settling, a relief that was too genuine to be performance. "I will be here in the spring," he said. "You have my word." She believed him, and this surprised her, because she was not a woman who took men's words on faith without evidence. But she had evidence now, and it was this. He had dug through 8 feet of snow and a sod roof to pull her into the light, and he had done it with his bare hands, and he had spent the days since doing nothing but exactly what he said he would do. A man who acted like that had a word worth believing. The winter passed. It passed the way hard winters do, slowly and with great intention, testing everything it touched. Clara kept the stove burning and the animals alive and the claim intact, going into Millbrook twice when the weather allowed, once in January for supplies, and once in February when Henderson caught some kind of chest ailment that required Gus Pedersen's judgment and some medicine from the general store. Henderson recovered, to no one's particular surprise, because he was that kind of mule. She thought about Eli Cade. She thought about him in the evenings when the fire burned and the wind talked to itself outside the walls. She thought about the particular way he had said her name on that last morning, and the way the morning light had been in the room between them. She thought about his hands and the sureness of them, and about the things he had said about his mother and Red Knife and the injustice of the reservation, and about how a man who thought about those things was a man worth knowing. She did not let herself hope too obviously, because she was practical, but she did not lie to herself either. She was a woman who had known love and who had lost it, and she knew the difference between the absence of feeling and the beginning of it. In March, the snow began to release its grip on the sandhills in the incremental, reluctant way of Nebraska springs, which come late and unevenly and leave a landscape that looks bruised and uncertain before it becomes, in the full sweetness of May, as beautiful as anything on earth. The grass came back green under the remnant patches of snow. The cottonwoods along the creek beds put out their first tentative silver-green leaves. The sky went from the hard white of winter to the deep, complicated blue of spring, the kind of blue that seems to have depth to it, as though you could fall upward into it. Clara was in the garden plot, breaking the first of the spring ground with Thomas's old spade, when she heard hoofbeats. She straightened and turned, shading her eyes against the April sun, and watched the rider come over the low ridge above the depression. He was exactly as she remembered, bigger if anything, or maybe she'd been making him smaller in her memory for the sake of caution. Brutus was moving at a steady trot, the big roan's ugly head bobbing with the rhythm of it, and Eli Cade was on him with that easy, settled authority of a man who had been on horseback for 1,000 miles and was comfortable with all of it. He had no pack mules, she noticed. He had come up from the south with only Brutus and what he could carry on one horse. He stopped at the edge of the garden and looked down at her from the saddle, and his gray-green eyes were warm with something that was past the careful, held-back assessment of the winter. He had been thinking, too. She could see it on him. "You are here," he said. "I told you I would be," she said. He dismounted in that single fluid motion and dropped Brutus's reins because Brutus would not go anywhere without being told to, and he stood in the new spring mud of her garden and looked at her as though he was checking that she was real. "You look good," he said. "The winter was kind to you." "The winter was not kind to anyone," she said, "but I survived it, which is good enough." He nodded and looked around at the claim, at the small sod house sitting solid and whole between its hills with its repaired roof and its south-facing window catching the morning light, at the lean-to where Henderson could be heard expressing opinions about something, at the 2 cows in the meadow where the grass was coming in green and dense. "The roof held," he said, with the satisfaction of a craftsman. "Beautifully," she said. He looked back at her. "I have something to say," he said. "Then say it," she said. He took a breath, and she had not seen him take a breath before a sentence before, and it moved her, the glimpse of something underneath the sureness. "I wintered on the Republican River," he said, "in a camp I have used before. I did what I always do in winter, which is maintain my gear and hunt and read the books I carry and talk to the horses for company." He paused. "This winter I also thought about Nebraska, about this stretch of country that I have been passing through for 6 years, about the particular stretch of it that has a sod house in a shallow depression between 2 hills. He looked at her steadily. "I thought about the woman in that house more than I have thought about any person in a long time." Clara set down her spade and stood looking at him in the April sunlight. "I'm not asking for anything you are not ready to give," he said. "I told you the spring was for knowing each other, and I meant that. I am asking if I can stay. On your claim, near here, whatever is correct and comfortable. I'm asking if you will let me be near you this spring and see what the spring makes of it." She thought about Thomas. She thought about grief and time, and the way the heart renews itself not by forgetting, but by growing room for what comes after. She thought about 8 feet of snow and a pair of gray-green eyes looking down through a hole in the darkness. "There is a section of the claim to the east," she said, "where the creek bed runs. A good camp could be made there." The corner of his mouth moved. "That is practical," he said. "I am a practical woman," she said. "You are," he agreed, and the warmth in his eyes was so genuine and so direct that she felt it in her chest like a hand pressed flat against it. "You will eat supper here," she said. "That is not a question." "No," he said, and picked up her spade. "I expect it is not." The spring became summer, and summer became the most important season of Clara Whitmore's life since the first summer she had come to Nebraska with Thomas, and understood all at once what this land could be if you loved it enough and worked it hard enough. Eli camped by the creek bed for 2 weeks, and then helped her with the resodding of the roof, which required 3 days of heavy work, and it was during the resodding that she came to understand something about him that she had felt but not yet articulated. He worked alongside her, not in the way that a man helps a woman, carrying the heavy things and directing the lighter, but in the way that 2 people of equal competence and complementary strength work together on a shared problem. He listened when she told him how Thomas had laid the original sod, considered it, offered a modification that was better, and explained why it was better, and then deferred to her decision when she accepted the modification, because it was her house, and he understood that. It was a small thing. It was an enormous thing. After the resodding, he moved his camp to the lean-to, which she offered because it was practical, and because Henderson had ceased actively trying to bite him, which Clara interpreted as a referendum on character. Evenings they sat on the step of the sod house and watched the sky go through its summer performance, the long Nebraska twilights that went from gold to coral to a deep violet that settled over the grassland like a benediction. He told her about the mountains in summer, and she told him about Ohio in spring, and they talked about books, which was the surprise that they had both read widely and thought about what they read, and the conversation could go from practical to philosophical without a seam, which was the rarest kind of conversation. He touched her first on an evening in June, not dramatically, not with the weight of decision on it. They were sitting on the step watching a lightning storm build on the western horizon, the kind that stays far enough away to be only beautiful, and she was cold because the evening had turned and she had not brought a shawl, and he put his arm around her shoulders. Simple, warm. His arm was heavy and solid, and she leaned into it without thinking, because it was comfortable in the way that sometimes, with some people, a thing is simply comfortable from the first moment. He looked down at her, and she looked up at him, and they were very close in the blue-purple light of the approaching storm. He kissed her like a man who was sure and unhurried, not demanding anything but offering everything, and she kissed him back the same way. And the lightning walked across the western horizon, and the smell of distant rain came across the grassland on the warm wind, and Clara thought, with perfect clarity, that this was the first new thing that had happened to her heart in a very long time. When they broke apart, his forehead rested briefly against hers, and his eyes were closed, and she could see that he was feeling the same newness of it. "I should tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I've been in love with you since the morning I dug you out of the snow," he said. "I want to be honest about that. I did not know it was love then. I thought it was relief that you were alive, and then I thought it was admiration, and then somewhere around the 3rd day I stopped arguing about what to call it." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him in the stormlight. "I have been in love with you since you said that my cows were doing better than expected," she said. "I did not know it was love then either." He laughed, the short, genuine laugh she had first heard in the blizzard camp, and this time she laughed with him, and his arm around her shoulders tightened, and she let it, leaning into the solid warmth of him. "What do we do about it?" she asked, though she had a good idea. "I was thinking," he said, "about whether a mountain man could become a sandhills man." She looked up at him. Could he? The mountains will always be in me, he said honestly. I will not pretend they will not. But a man can be two things. He can love the high country and still choose to come down from it, for the right reason. The mountains will be 3 days' ride, she said. If you needed to go sometimes, it would not be unreasonable. He looked at her with an expression that was so full of something she felt it like light. You would let me go to the mountains. I would not let you become something you are not, she said. That would be a poor way to love someone. He was quiet for a long moment, and the storm moved closer, and the thunder began to be audible in the distance, low and rolling. Marry me, he said. It was direct and simple, and she had known it was coming in some form, and still the actual words made her breath catch. I am still grieving Thomas, she said, because she owed him that every time. I know that, he said, with the steady patience she had come to know as his essential quality. I am not asking you to stop. I am asking if you will grieve him with a husband beside you. She thought about Thomas, about the life they had built and the love they had shared, and the way he had died too young in this hard country that he had loved. She thought about what Thomas would say, if he could say anything. She thought about the way he had looked at their small sod house with his chest puffed out, proud of the thing he had built, wanting for her a life that was full and warm and held by strong things. Yes, she said. He exhaled, and the relief and joy in it were unperformed and unashamed, and he pressed his lips to her hair and held her there on the step of her sod house while the lightning walked closer and the thunder rolled its agreement across the Nebraska grassland. They were married in September at the Millbrook Church, on a day of blue sky and gold grass and the particular crisp clarity that comes to the sandhills in early autumn, when the summer heat is broken and the world smells of dry grass and distant wood smoke and the first cold edge of the coming season. Martha Connolly cried, which surprised no one. Gus Pedersen stood up with Eli, enormous in his Sunday coat, and old Jacob Prentice read from the Bible in a voice that creaked like a saddle but carried the weight of genuine belief. Clara wore the blue dress she'd been keeping in her trunk since she could not remember when, and she had her hair done up properly for the first time since Thomas's funeral, and she stood in the small whitewashed church and made her promises in a clear, steady voice, looking at Eli Cade's gray-green eyes the whole time. He made his promises with his shoulders square and his jaw set and his voice carrying without effort through the small space, and when the minister said he could kiss his bride, he kissed her in the way she was coming to know, sure and unhurried and warm, and someone in the back of the church made a sound of approval, and someone else laughed. The supper at Martha's was the best event Millbrook had staged in recent memory, which was admittedly not a high bar, but people from 3 or 4 neighboring claims came in, and there was dancing, and Eli danced with her in the way she had not expected, because he was light on his feet for a man his size, and he held her with his big hands at her waist and looked at her like she was the most interesting thing he had ever seen. You can dance, she said. My mother taught me, he said. She said a man who could not dance was only half a man. Your mother was a wise woman, Clara said. She would have loved you, he said, and his voice was warm and a little sad in the way of a man who knows his mother would never meet his wife, and Clara squeezed his hand. They went home to the sod house that night, to the small earthen home that Thomas had built and Eli had repaired, and they began their life together in the most literal sense, in the room where Clara had pounded on the ceiling in the dark and waited for someone who came. Eli brought the mountains with him, in ways that she had expected and ways she had not. He brought the organization and the competence and the quiet self-sufficiency. He brought the knowledge of the land that went deeper than any farmer's, the understanding of weather and game and grass and water that his years in the high country had given him. He brought a gentleness with her animals that Henderson eventually surrendered to, the old mule one afternoon dropping his head against Eli's broad chest with the resignation of a creature who has decided to stop fighting the inevitable. He brought books. This was the surprise she had been expecting, but still delighted in. He had a pack of them, pulled from trading posts and travelers and borrowed and returned across a decade of mountain living, and they filled the small shelf Thomas had made in the wall above the fireplace and spilled off it onto the window ledge and the small table. Clara brought him into the settled rhythms of homestead life with the same matter-of-fact competence she brought to everything, showing him the particular needs of this specific piece of land, where the drainage problems were in the spring, how the wells needed to be managed, how the sandhills grass responded to different grazing patterns. He listened with the attentiveness he brought to everything she said, the quality of his listening that made her feel, always, that what she knew was worth knowing. He added to the claim in the first year with the accumulated sense of a man who thought about the shape of a thing and how to improve it. He built a proper barn, a real timber frame structure hauled piece by piece from Millbrook, because the sod lean-to was not adequate for the animals he intended to add to the herd. He dug a better drainage channel on the east side of the house. He built a root cellar with twice the capacity of the original, dug deep and well-lined and accessible through a proper door rather than the half-buried hatch Thomas had managed. He also, in the winter of their first year together, went to the mountains for 3 weeks. He told her 6 weeks in advance because he was a man who did not do things that affected other people without adequate discussion. He described the specific trip, where he would go and what route and how long, with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to everything. He asked her directly if she was comfortable. She was. She told him she was, and she meant it, and she spent the 3 weeks he was gone managing the claim, with the brisk competence that was her natural state, and she also missed him with a specific physical ache that told her something absolute about the nature of what they had. When he came back, riding over the ridge above the depression on a cold February afternoon, with his breath steaming and Brutus's breath steaming and the pack mules loaded with the winter's take, she was standing outside the barn because she had heard the hoofbeats and known them, and he saw her from the ridge and put Brutus to a canter. He rode down to her and swung off the horse in that single fluid motion and took her face in his cold, scarred hands and kissed her in the February cold, and it was worth the 3 weeks. "The mountains are still there," he said against her hair. "I know," she said. "How were they?" "Cold and beautiful and empty," he said. "And all the way there and all the way back, every night when I made camp, I thought about coming home." She pulled back enough to look at his face, at the windburn and the satisfaction and the particular quality in his eyes that she had learned to read as joy. "Good," she said, "because Henderson has been insufferable without you." Their first child was born in the autumn of 1881, a boy they named Daniel Thomas Cade, and he came into the world on a clear September morning in the sod house with the widow Halverson attending and Eli in the room because he had simply refused to be excluded, and no one had the authority or the inclination to force a man like Eli Cade out of the room where his wife was laboring. He held the baby with a care that was somehow shocking from hands that size, the enormous scarred hands cradling the new small thing with perfect sureness, and Clara watched him and felt something so large and complete she could not find the edges of it. "Daniel Thomas," Eli said, the name slow and careful, and he looked at Clara over the baby's head with eyes that were wet in a way she had never seen before, and did not make her love him less for seeing. "Thomas would have liked him," she said. "He will know the name," Eli said. "He will know what it means." Daniel Thomas grew into the kind of child who combined his mother's determination with his father's physical sureness, walking early and talking in complete sentences at an age that made Widow Halverson shake her head, and taking after his father in the particular way of climbing everything that could be climbed. Eli carried him on his shoulders through the Nebraska grassland, and showed him the way the sky read before a storm, and taught him the names of the grasses. And Clara watched them move through the tall summer grass, the enormous dark-haired man and the small dark-haired boy, and thought that love, when it came around again after loss, did not come smaller. It came larger, because you knew what it cost. Their second child, a daughter they named Eleanor Ruth, arrived in the spring of 1883 with considerably less drama than her brother, arriving quickly and efficiently in the manner of a girl who had decided she was ready and saw no reason to linger over the business. She had her mother's red-brown hair and her father's gray-green eyes, and from the first week she regarded the world with the direct, assessing gaze of a person who was going to have opinions about it. Eli put Eleanor in the crook of his arm and stood in the doorway of the sod house with Daniel on his shoulders, and looked out at the spring morning, at the grass coming in green and new under the pale blue sky, at the barn he had built, and the improved root cellar and the expanded garden plot and the creek bed where he had first made his camp, and Clara came and stood beside him and leaned against the door frame. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I am thinking," he said, "that this is a good piece of earth." "It is," she said. "And I'm thinking that I cannot remember what it felt like to plan only as far as tomorrow," he said, "which is something I would not have thought possible 4 years ago." She looked up at him. Daniel was trying to pull the dark hair away from his face, which Eli suffered with patient, long-suffering dignity. Eleanor had gone to sleep in his arm with the absolute trust of the very young. "Are you sorry?" Clara asked, meaning not just any one thing but everything, the mountains and the solitude and the years before, all of it. He looked at her with the gray-green eyes that had first looked down at her through a hole in the snow and darkness, and said, without any hesitation, "No." She reached up and took his free hand in hers, the enormous hand that had dug through 8 feet of packed snow with nothing but will and muscle, and held it. "Good," she said. By 1885, the claim had grown, not in acreage, which they had kept to the original quarter section plus the additional quarter Clara had proved up and earned title to in 1882, but in the fullness of what those acres held. The barn was a proper working barn now, housing a small herd of cattle in addition to the original cows in Henderson, who had achieved a kind of legendary status in the surrounding country as the oldest, most contrary, most reliably alive mule in Harlan County. The house itself had been extended, Eli and 2 men from Millbrook adding a proper room on the south side, framed in timber and plastered on the interior, with a window that faced the garden and caught the afternoon light. The root cellar was never going to run short of stores again. Eli had been methodical about that in a way that Clara understood came from a man who had nearly not reached her in time, who had looked at a stovepipe barely clearing the snow and known it was chance and not preparedness that had kept that thin thread of smoke visible. The winter stores were always doubled, the firewood was always stacked higher than it needed to be. The animals were always brought in a week before any reasonable estimate of need. Clara had been to Millbrook and argued successfully with the particular quality of argument she brought to things she believed in, for a school to be built and staffed properly, rather than the 3-days-a-week arrangement in the church. And the school was under construction, and a proper school teacher from Illinois was arriving in the spring. She had done this by organizing the women of the surrounding claims into a group that appeared at the land office and the territorial representatives' meetings with such regularity and such documented need that resistance became more trouble than agreement. Eli had watched this campaign with undisguised admiration. "You would have made a formidable general," he said one evening, when she returned from a Millbrook meeting where the last opposition had been finally overcome. "I would have made a terrible general," she said, taking off her coat and hanging it on the hook. "I'm far too particular about the reasons for the fight." "That is what makes a good general," he said from the floor where he was sitting with Daniel against his side, listening to the boy read, both of them frowning over the same page with the same expression. She looked at the 2 of them, at the dark heads bent together over the book in the lamplight, and then at Eleanor asleep in the cradle by the stove, and at the room around them, the extended warm house with its books and its lamp and its stove burning steady, and its 2 windows catching the night outside and reflecting the interior light. This was what Thomas had wanted for her. She was certain of it. Not this specific form of it, not this precise arrangement of people and barn and cattle and books, but this quality of it, this fullness, this solidity. Thomas had built this house from the earth and put her in it, and then had to leave. And he had left it solid and real, and she had stayed in it, and kept it, and added to it, and eventually the earth itself had sent her someone to stand in it with her. She sat down on the bench beside the stove and picked up Eleanor, who stirred and settled and went back to sleep on her shoulder. And she listened to Daniel reading slowly and carefully to his father, mispronouncing something, and then listening to Eli's gentle correction and trying again. The lamp burned. The stove crackled. Outside, the autumn wind moved through the grass of the Nebraska sandhills with the sound it always made, which was not lonesome anymore but familiar, the sound of her land doing what land does, persisting and enduring and offering up its particular flat, wide, indomitable beauty to whoever was paying attention. It was in the winter of 1886 that the snow came again in the manner of 1879, and the sandhills saw a blizzard that old Jacob Prentice, who had been watching the sky for 50 years, said was the worst since 1875. It came the same way, from the north, fast and hard, with the particular yellow-gray sky that preceded it. Clara and Eli watched it come from the doorway of their house. Daniel was inside with Eleanor, who was 3 years old, and had definite opinions about the snow, which she wished to go out in and which her parents had decreed she would not, a decree she was contesting with considerable energy. The firewood was doubled and stacked. The root cellar was full. The animals were in the barn, which was a real barn with real timbers, braced to carry whatever the sky sent. The roof of the house had been reinforced 3 times since Eli first sistered those joists in the cold dark of the buried house, and it sat solid and low and certain between its hills. "It is going to be a bad one," Clara said. "Yes," Eli said. She looked at him in the failing afternoon light, at the broad set of his shoulders and the dark hair that still fell past his collar, the silver thread in his beard that had spread now through the whole lower half of it and made him look, she thought, distinguished in a way he was entirely unaware of. He was watching the storm come with the same calm he brought to everything, reading the sky with the practiced eye of a man who had learned to work with the weather rather than against it, to read its intentions and accommodate them rather than resist them. "I am not afraid," she said, and was surprised by how true it was. He looked down at her. "No," he said. "You never were. That was the first thing I knew about you." She thought about the girl she had been in the dark of the buried house, pounding the ceiling with her cast-iron pot, not frantically but with purpose, because there was nothing else to do and doing nothing was not in her. She did not think that girl had been fearless. She thought that girl had been afraid and had done the thing anyway, which was the only kind of courage worth having. "I was afraid," she said. "I was terrified, actually. But I am practical enough to know that terror does not change anything. Only action changes things." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood in the doorway and watched the northern sky come south toward them with the storm inside it, and the wind began to build in the grass with the long, rising note of something enormous arriving. "We should go in," he said. "Yeah." "Yes," she said, but neither of them moved for another moment, standing together in the cold doorway with the storm coming and the house warm behind them. And she thought about what it meant to stand like this, shoulder to shoulder, with no fear because the fear had been used up on the earlier version of this, and what was left was only the knowledge that she had been buried once and dug out, and that nothing that came after that could be as dark or as cold, because now she knew with perfect certainty that someone would always dig down through whatever was above her to find her. She turned and went inside, and he followed, and the door closed against the building wind, and the storm hit in the night and screamed its way across the sandhills the way it had 7 years before. But the house held, and the barn held, and in the morning the world was white and clean and new, and there was plenty of firewood, and the coffee was hot, and Daniel sat on the floor building a fort from the firewood, and Eleanor sat on her father's enormous foot, demanding that he walk her around the room, which he did, slowly and with great dignity, while Clara stood at the window and watched the white landscape turn gold in the rising sun. "Papa," Eleanor said, in the imperious tone of a 3-year-old who has received exactly what she wanted and is already considering the next thing she wants. "Again." "Again," Eli said, and walked her around the room again. Clara turned from the window and looked at her family in the warm lamplight of the extended sod house, at her husband carrying her daughter on his foot with solemn patience, at her son building something on the floor with a concentration that was the image of his father's, at the books on the shelf and the lamp burning and the stove going steady and the smell of coffee in the warm air. And she thought about the year 1879 and the dark and the cold and the thin thread of smoke rising from a buried stovepipe. She thought about a man who had seen that thread of smoke and known it for what it was, and had gotten off his horse and dug with his bare hands until he found her. Some things were better than hope. Some things were real. She poured the coffee and brought it to him, and he took it and caught her hand and held it for a moment, looking up at her from where he sat on the floor, with Eleanor climbing his back now with her small, serious face, and in his gray-green eyes was everything he had said to her over 7 years in rooms and ravines, and on steps and in lamplight, and in the long, sweet Nebraska evenings, all of it collected and present, and she squeezed his hand, and he let her go, and she went back to her window and the golden morning. Outside, the sandhills stretched away in every direction under their white coverlet, and the sky above them was the particular pure blue that follows a hard storm, the blue that seems to go up forever, the blue that was the country's way of apologizing for what it had done and promising, not that it would not do it again, because it would, but that it would always eventually give back the morning. The stovepipe caught the sun. A thin thread of smoke rose from it and bent in the slight remaining wind and dispersed into the blue air above the sandhills, visible for a long way, telling anyone who could read it that this house was alive, that this fire was burning, that there were people in it who had been through the dark and the cold and the buried silence, and had come through on the other side into something that the storm could bury temporarily but could never, now, put out.